And welcome to the basic watercolor techniques lesson. I'm just going to teach you the basic techniques to get you started in watercolor. And the first one is the flat wash on dry paper. Just a thin, even layer of a single color of paint, can be done wet or dry, and it can cover the whole sheet or just a small specific area. Most of the other techniques are a variation of the flat wash, so you really want to learn the flat wash well. It's good for backgrounds, underpainting for glazing technique, and solid colored objects, just to name a few things it's good for. So let's just go ahead, jump in, and get started with me showing you how to do a flat wash on dry paper. The first thing you'll do is start with your dry paper. You'll want to go ahead and mix up a good sized puddle of paint, one that you can make sure that there's enough paint to finish the whole area without having to mix more paint. You'll load your brush up, start at the very top, and then you'll just take and drag a bead of paint all the way across in a nice smooth stroke, and then back, overlapping the strokes just a little bit, and you'll keep pulling that bead until the bead almost disappears, and then you'll pick up a little bit more paint, continue with that bead, pushing and pulling, overlapping the stroke slightly, but never going back in and going over and over a stroke, because you'll leave streaks, cause blooms or blossoms, and it'll look fussy. You just keep going in a nice even strokes, and there you'll have a beautiful one color wash. So the next one is the flat wash wet. You'll start with the dry paper, then you'll put a nice clear coat of water on it, a nice clear sheen. You don't want puddles, you don't want drips, you want it to be just a nice thin layer of clear water. Make sure that you've washed your brush first, especially if you're going to use two different colors, if you're going to do a glazing technique. But I don't want to confuse you, so for right now, just clean water, nice clean layer of water to start. Then you'll get your paint, just like with the flat dry wash. You'll have already mixed up enough paint to cover the area that you plan on painting, and you'll just drop it in and just do smooth overlapping strokes, pushing that bead of paint from side to side, gathering up more. If you need more, you can get more, and then pulling it and pushing it. Another good tip is to make sure that your paper is tilted when you do this, because gravity is your friend and it'll help it make it an even wash. And you see with that water, it makes it look much more velvetier than the dry wash, the dry paper wash. So now the next technique that we are going to start is the graded wash one color. Thin layer of one color gradually changes in value from one section to the next section. And in this graded wash with the one color, you can use it for backgrounds, landscapes, objects that gradually change value. For example, a ball, a curved surface like a cup or a flower, petals, something that's curving, and you want it to change color or temperature or tonal value. So we have the dry paper, and what you're going to do is you're going to load your brush just like with the flat wash, and you're going to do the strokes, pull the bead of paint across, overlapping, making a nice, smooth, even wash. But then you dip your paper in your brush in water, and you continue down with water. You do not dip your brush back in the paint. Only back in the water, and use whatever paint is on your brush in the water again, and it makes it lighter. Each time you dip your brush into the clean water, it's going to lighten the paint. And you can do this until it almost looks clear. So it goes gradually from dark to light when you get to the bottom. Great for skies. Another technique with the graded wash is the graded wash with two colors. Now the graded wash with two colors is a thin layer of two colors that gradually change from one color to a second color. And it can also be done with several colors or in stripes to make it look variegated. And let me just demonstrate that for you. And I want you to practice these whenever you can. This is good practice for you, and it helps you learn control and what the washes will do. So here I have pink and I have blue. We're going to start with the blue at the top. Again, the flat wash is our base technique. We're going to start putting on a flat wash of the blue, and we're going to do nice, smooth, even strokes, pulling the bead of paint down, getting more paint when the bead seems to be running out. Excuse me, sorry about that. And then we're going to continue down about 2/3 way of the section that you want to paint. Then we're going to dip into the pink, and we're going to start at the bottom again with the flat wash technique. Make sure your brush is loaded. This brush isn't completely loaded with the pink, so you can see some white skips there, but don't worry about them. The technique is what I want you to focus on. And so you just do the even wash up into the blue, and you'll see it already starts to change color. It looks beautiful. This could be a sunset, a sunrise, the start of a sunset or a sunrise. And there you go. It is really beautiful. So you have blue, purple, and pink, or pink, purple, and blue. Now our next technique is called priming the paper. And that's just wetting the paper and allowing the water to sink into the paper but not dry. Then wetting the paper again before you add the paint. And that makes sure that the inner core of the paper, the inner layers, are moist, and it slows down the drying time. And so you might want to ask me, well, why am I priming the paper? Well, again, it allows a longer working time. The paper doesn't dry as quickly. So if you have a large background you need to get done, but you don't need it to dry too fast, it helps you there. It keeps it from drying. It also creates soft, blurry, velvety backgrounds, and it helps to avoid any unwanted hard edges. So let me show you how to do the priming method. You'll start out with dry paper. And what you'll want to do is you will want to lay down a nice, clean layer of water, just like when you did the wet wash. The flat wash on wet paper, same thing. You're going to lay down a nice layer, thin layer of clean water. You don't want drips and bubbles. We want this to be a nice, smooth, even layer. Make sure you cover the whole surface with the water. And then what you're going to do is you're going to let it sit for a little bit. Once you get all of it on there to the whole area that you want to prime, where you intend to work. Like I said, this is great for a large area that you want to work on because it keeps the paper from drying completely. Once you prime it, now you see the sheen, it's a nice soft sheen. You want to let that sink in just a little bit. You don't want it to dry completely. You just want it to start looking matte colored or satin colored. Satin sheen, the texture. You don't want it shiny. You want it more satiny, more matte colored. Then what you're going to do is you are going to come back in, make sure that you have enough paint mixed first for what you're going to do. So we're just going to go ahead and mix that paint up in a big puddle before we start, because we want to make sure we don't have to stop in the middle and mix more paint. Then once we get that mixed up, make sure you clean your brush really well, because you're going to come back in and you're going to add another layer of clear water. And the first layer was to prime the paper. Now this layer of water, we want it to sit on top of the paper. We don't want it to sink in because we already have some water in the middle of the paper, in the center core of it. So we're just going to go ahead, nice even wash, no petals, no drips, no blips. Put that even wash of water, and then you're just going to go in and you can just drop your color in. I'm making this into an even wash. You can do it with all different colors that you might want to drop in. If you're doing a background, you might put some green in there, some blues, some reds, whatever. We're just going to use this one color because I just want you to do the technique of priming to see how it works. And once you prime your paper, you can add any color paint you want. The whole purpose is to keep it from drying too fast. Now the second technique, or another technique, is going to be charging color. And that's just wetting the paper and then dropping in colors randomly and allowing them to flow and mix. Something important is different colors have a different flow. They'll spread out quicker than other colors. So you might want to experiment with that. It really is great for backgrounds, foliage, landscapes, sky effects, abstract effects, and objects that have a lot of colors in them. And these are just a few of the things. Use your imagination for how you can use this technique. It's not just limited to these things. As always, I want you to make it your own. Use your imagination. So let me show you how to do that. So when you charge color, you'll want to wet your paper first with some clear water, because you want the surface of the water really pretty wet, and it can still be shiny. It doesn't have to sink in and be matte. You want it pretty wet. You can have puddles, but I just don't like a lot of puddles on my paper, so I make sure that I don't have puddles and drips. But I do make sure that all of the paper is covered with water. There's no dry spots so that there will be a hiccup. And then I just begin dropping in whatever colors that I have selected beforehand, and just drop them in and let them mingle and mix all on their own. Some of the colors will flow out really far from where you drop them. Some will stay fairly local to wherever you put them. It just depends on the paint. You can practice to see which ones have the flow that will spread out real fast. And you can come back and add more color or more of the same color in areas to get it darker. So this is called charging color, where you just charge color into a wash you've already made. And you can even tilt the paper, let them mix and mingle, and it comes up with some really, really pretty effects. All right, now the next technique is softening edges. And that just means you're removing a hard or solid edge and creating a gradual lightening of the color. This technique is used a lot for showing the shape of an object. It shows how the light hits it, flower petals, leaves, fruit, etc. And it can also be used to show the changes of shadow or color. So I just did sort of a little flower shape here, and it's dry paper. I'm just going to go ahead and put this rose color paint onto the dry paper. And I'm just going to let that sit for a second. And then I'm going to come back in with some clear water, and I'm just going to go right on that edge with that clear water and begin to just fade it out. So this is one way that you can soften edges. Now this edge has not dried, so this is a technique for if the edge has not already dried. You just take a little clear water and pull it out. If you have too much paint in an area, you can take your brush and pick up some of that paint, but make sure you dab your brush with the paper towel first, because you want the brush to only be damp, not wet. Now this is a way to soften edges. I've wet the petal first, and now I'm dropping that pink colored, rose colored paint in there, and you see it's starting to spread, but it's spreading unevenly and with a jiggity jaggedy edge. So I'm going to remove some of the moisture from my paintbrush, and I'm going to use the tip to just take and blend that paint into that water that we laid down. Remember, I laid down water first, so this is actually a wet and wet technique. So the water was there first. I laid down a thin line of the pink paint, and I'm just using the damp brush to blend that paint out into the wet water so that it softens the edge. Now you can also do it the opposite way. I'm going to lay down some paint, and it's fairly thick actually, and I'm dabbing my brush off. It has a little bit of water on it, and then I'm just pulling that paint out from the center. This is just to do it from the center and let the outside edge be soft and lighter. Then I just take clear water on my brush and blend it on out. Just blend it out. So that's another way to soften edges. You can do it from the inside to the outside to the inside. Now here I let this one dry completely. So for this one, I'm going to wet it. Now this is already dried. This edge has dried hard. It's dry. So I've wet it with some clear water. And I'm going to take a short bristled brush, and I'm just going to lightly, in circular motions, just rub that paint, kind of scrub it a little, not too much. You don't want to tear your paper up, but you will just take that and lightly pull some of that paint up, and it will blend it beautifully and soften that edge. No more hard edge. It's really pretty. So now the next technique is how to lift paint, which is very similar to what I just showed you with the blending of the edge. And it just means removing excess paint to allow the white of the paper to show through. But now staining paint colors may be hard to lift once they're dry, so keep that in mind. And it can be done when the paint is wet or if it's dry. So those are some of the things you want to keep in mind when you're about to lift some paint. Now, this is good for removing unwanted paint, softening an edge, adding some interest to a background, creating a design like polka dots maybe, or indicating dappled light. That's what lifting paint is generally used for by artists. It's some of these things here. So what you're going to do is I have some paint and it's still wet. I just laid it down, but it's still wet. So I am taking a brush and it is damp. It is not a wet brush, it's a damp brush. I have removed the excess water on a paper towel and I'm just coming in there and lifting up the paint while it's still wet and allowing that white paper to shine through and just taking away the excess paint. Now, this is completely dried and I'm going to show you how to lift the paint from the completely dried. You'll take your little short bristled brush, a little scrubber brush, you'll wet it, and then wherever you want to lift the paint, you'll just work that brush. I'm just doing a little circle here. You'll work that brush in a circular motion or in a line motion, whatever shape you want to do, and lift the paint from here. And always remember, you can do this dry or wet, but make sure it's a non-staining color. So now we're going to the dry brush, and that's just applying paint with a damp, almost dry brush. Great for texture, wood texture, sparkles on water, fabric texture, sand, gravel, dirt, and weathered buildings. So I'm going to use my flat brush for this because it will work a little better. And the whole technique is you want to load your brush up and the brush is completely dry. You have not put any water in it. You're just picking up pure paint at this point. And you'll just go along the paper, and if you can see, it doesn't leave a clean solid stroke. It leaves sort of like a sandy look, like there's little holes. The white of the paper shows through in little dots. It's a really rough looking texture. I'm overlapping it just to show you what you can do with it. Now I've got a little bit more water on there, and where the brush is a little wetter, you can see it's more of a solid stroke with just some of the things. So, and just to recap, we have the flat wash on dry paper, flat wash on wet paper, which is commonly known as wet and wet. You have your graded wash where it goes light to dark or dark to light, whichever. You have a graded wash with two colors where you go smoothly from one color and transition into another color. Then you have charging color, priming paper, and that's where you wet your paper, let that soak in, wet it again, let that soak in, and that just keeps your paper wet for when you want to do a lot of wet and wet techniques, and it keeps it from drying too fast. Then you have the charging color where you wet your paper and you just drop colors in there. It's very spontaneous. It has a beautiful effect. It is really, really pretty when you do that and so unexpected. Then you have softening edges to keep the hard edges down and to make a smooth gradation from light to dark. Then you also have lifting paint, and you can do that wet or dry. You can do it while the paint is still wet and lift up some of that excess paint, or you can wait for the paint to dry and then either wet it and scrub some of that up or just lift it up. Then you have the dry brush, which just creates a beautiful texture. You just have a very dry brush. It's just barely damp. And then you put a lot of pigment on there and just drag it across the surface of the paper. And those bumps on the surface of the paper will leave little white spots and give it a beautiful dry brush texture. So I hope y'all have enjoyed this. Remember, you can, if you're in my Patreon, you can download your PDF. If you are a Dabbler member or above, I'll have a PDF special for you to go over these techniques. So I hope to see you in my Patreon, and y'all be good to yourselves, and remember that art is not stressful. It is meant to be relaxing. So go practice these techniques and relax a little bit. You can't do these wrong, and the more you practice, the better you'll get at them.